Emma had always been proud of her choice to live off the beaten path. The farmhouse she called home was miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by rolling fields and dense woods. Most nights, the silence was her greatest comfort. But on this night, the silence pressed down on her like a weight. It was 3:14 a.m. when she woke up, drenched in sweat. Her dream had been unsettling. Something about being watched, though she couldn't remember the details. Sitting up in bed, she scanned the dark room, her eyes adjusting to the faint glow of moonlight spilling in through the curtains. A chill crept over her, though the room wasn't cold. Emma tried to calm herself, rationalizing the unease as just the after-effects of a nightmare. But then she noticed something, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Her breath caught, and she turned toward the window. The curtain was drawn, but she felt certain someone or something was on the other side. Trembling, she swung her legs over the bed and tiptoed across the room. Every step felt heavier than the last, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. When she reached the window, she hesitated. What if she was imagining it? Or worse, what if she wasn't? Summoning her courage, she pulled the curtain back an inch and peered out. There in the yard was a figure. It stood motionless, silhouetted against the pale moonlight. It wasn't a man, at least, not entirely. Its form was tall and unnaturally thin, its head tilted slightly as if examining her. Emma felt a scream rising in her throat, but she was frozen in place, unable to move or look away. Finally, her instincts kicked in. She dropped the curtain and stumbled back, grabbing her phone off the nightstand. "Someone's outside my house," she whispered to the 911 operator. "Please send help." The dispatcher reassured her, but the minutes felt like hours as she waited for the police to arrive. When she dared to peek outside again, the figure was gone. The officers arrived shortly after, searching the property but finding nothing. They assured her it was likely a prank or a passerby, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else. The next morning, her worst fears were confirmed. Outside her bedroom window were muddy footprints that circled the house several times, but what truly chilled her were the faint, claw-like scratches on the glass, on the inside. That was the last night Emma spent in that house. Jack had always been a cautious man. He avoided taking risks, stuck to routines, and rarely deviated from his well-laid plans. But that night, as he drove down a foggy country road, his usual caution wavered. It was late, past 2 a.m., and he was exhausted from a long day at work. The road ahead was barely visible, shrouded in thick mist that seemed to absorb the beams of his headlights. The air was cold, and the sound of rain pattering against the windshield added to the eerie atmosphere. As Jack rounded a bend, he saw him, a lone figure standing on the roadside, hunched over and drenched. The man wore a tattered jacket that clung to his thin frame, and his head was bowed as if in defeat. Jack hesitated. He'd always been told not to pick up hitchhikers, but something about the man's posture struck a chord. Against his better judgment, he pulled over and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" he called out. The man nodded silently, lifting his head to reveal hollow, sunken eyes. Without a word, he opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. For the first few minutes, the silence in the car was deafening. Jack tried to make small talk, asking where the man was headed, but received no response. The hitchhiker simply stared straight ahead, his face blank, and his body unnervingly still. Then, in a low, raspy voice, the man spoke. "Be careful on the road ahead," he said, his tone dripping with foreboding. Jack frowned. "What do you mean?" he asked, glancing at the man. But when he turned, the seat was empty. The door hadn't opened, and there had been no sound, yet the hitchhiker was gone. Jack's confusion quickly turned to alarm. He gripped the wheel tightly and slowed down, his eyes scanning the road. That's when he saw it. Just ahead, two cars were piled together in a mangled wreck, blocking the entire road. If Jack hadn't slowed down, he would have driven straight into the debris. Shaken, Jack pulled over and called for help. As he waited for emergency services, he couldn't stop thinking about the hitchhiker. Who was he? How had he vanished? And most importantly, how had he known about the crash? Jack never found the answers, but he would never forget that eerie warning, or the life it saved him from losing. Mark and Kevin were lifelong friends, bonded by their shared love of adventure. They prided themselves on exploring places others avoided, and Whispering Woods, a dense forest, rumored to be haunted, was their latest challenge. The locals warned them not to go. Stories of strange occurrences, disembodied voices, and people disappearing into the woods were common. But Mark and Kevin laughed it off. Ghost stories didn't scare them. The first day of their trip was uneventful. They hiked deep into the woods, setting up camp in a clearing surrounded by towering trees. As the sun set, they built a fire and settled in, trading jokes and ghost stories of their own. The forest was eerily quiet, but they chalked it up to the remote location. Around midnight, as they sat by the dying embers of their fire, Mark heard it, a faint whisper. He froze, straining to listen. "Did you hear that?" he asked Kevin, who shook his head. Moments later, the whisper came again, louder this time. It sounded like someone speaking, but the words were impossible to make out. The whispers grew more distinct as the night wore on, circling their tent. Then, chillingly, they began to hear their names. Mark, Kevin. The voices were distorted, low, and filled with a sinister edge. Terrified, the friends grabbed their flashlights and stepped outside. What they saw made their blood run cold. Surrounding their campsite were trees marked with strange symbols, freshly carved into the bark. The symbols were intricate and ominous, and neither of them could explain how they had appeared. Panicked, they decided to leave immediately. As they packed, the whispers grew louder, now accompanied by faint rustling sounds in the bushes. It felt as though they were being watched. The hike back to their car was a nightmare. Shadows seemed to dart between the trees, and the whispers followed them, growing louder and more mocking. When they finally reached their car, Kevin turned back for one last look. In the dim glow of their taillights, he saw a figure standing among the trees, tall, dark, and motionless. It didn't follow them, but its presence was enough to haunt their dreams for weeks. Neither Mark nor Kevin ever returned to Whispering Woods. The memory of that night stayed with them, a chilling reminder that some places are better left unexplored. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Also, click that like button and leave a comment below and let us know what other true horror stories you'd like to hear. Until next time.